Hello, and welcome to the podcast that tries to answer one simple question. What is this thing called film noir? I'm your host, Sergio Angelini, and welcome to Tipping My Fedora, where we discuss movies, books, TV, radio, and much more besides, all from the darker side of the street. Maths supremo, blogger, podcaster, and mystery author, Jim Noy is also one of the nicest people I know. His novel, The Red Death Murders, was published during the COVID lockdown, and is a highly imaginative whodunit, set sometime in the past during the plague imagined by Edgar Allan Poe for his classic short story, The Mask of Red Death. You should go to Amazon and buy that book right away. I'll wait for you. If you love locked room mysteries in a historical setting, you won't be disappointed. He also blogs about crime fiction at theinvisibleevent.com and hosts his own podcast, In Gad We Trust, Gad being short for Golden Age of Detection. He's also a lover of the works of Jim Thompson, so I just had to sit down and gab with him about one of our favourite noir authors. Here's how it went. Jim, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Absolute delight to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
We are here to discuss a certain aspect of your interest which seems to me, diverge a little bit. You're someone who I know because of your love of Golden Age, interwar fiction, Agatha Christie, John Rode, John Dixon Carr, all our favourites. But today we're going to talk about Jim Thompson, a very different kind of writer. So before we get into that, he's very much a noir writer, someone who belongs to that pulp fiction era of the 50s and 60s. What's your definition of noir?
I think, if I may start off by flouting my bilingual credentials, the fact that we are referring to it as black noir as an indicator of what to expect from this genre, or this subgenre. I suppose there has to be an element of it which is very comfortable delving into the darker, slightly seedier side of crime. The fixation with detection, people will tell you, although it is not true, is in the re-establishment of a status quo. There is a sense with detection that you have a crime, and no matter how complex and no matter how morally ambiguous it might seem, there is always a nice, tidy, comprehensible solution to it. For me, I think there's got to be an element of noir, and there's something I very much get from Thompson, which I don't get from my detection, which is very comfortable leaving aspects of things unresolved, which delves perhaps a little deeper into things which are perhaps a little darker, and then doesn't always feel the need to tidily tie it off in the end, and will leave you dangling and leave you wondering and leave you questioning about aspects of what has gone on before. And that's something I think, in my limited exposure to film noir and to noir on the page, that's something which really makes it stand out from the swathes of detective fiction that I'm generally, as you say, better known for reading.
And so what's the noir book that did it for you then? What turned you onto it?
The very first experience of noir on the page for me was Double Indemnity by James M. Cain. I got into classic era detective fiction via the Orion Crime Masterwork series, which was published at the start of the 21st century. I had read a little bit of Raymond Chandler. Didn't really get Chandler. I've never really been much of a Chandler fan. I know you and I will discuss this probably at some other time. I'd read a little bit of Hammett, and then I came across the Orion Crime Masterwork series, I think the 6th or 7th volume of which was Double Indemnity, and I went in with no idea what to expect. And it's a magnificently sudden and bleak descent into some very amoral stuff that is so bracing and so fabulously unapologetic and so very comfortable in making you uncomfortable, and so very desperately not bothered about whether you want some things answered, whether you want things kind of nicely rounded off. I found Thompson as part of the same series. I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe The Getaway was the first Thompson I read in that series. There is very much a chord connecting Kane to Thompson. I feel Kane and Thompson, Kane for me is most successful in Double Indemnity. I've read about 8 or 9 of Kane's novels and nothing comes close to that amoral, almost kind of helpless descent. Postman Always Rings Twice doesn't do it for me. Serenade doesn't do it for me. Mildred Pierce doesn't do it for me. There's nothing else which kind of matches for me in Thompson's work. That wonderful descent into the darker side of very understandable, very human emotion. It's very kind of lust-driven, very sex-driven, very avarice-driven. It's tremendously inward-looking. It's very much about somebody getting what they want at the expense of the people around them. And then the lovely thing about Indemnity is the way in which it turns around and bites Walter Huff. The way in which he suddenly, I think there's a lovely line where he's like, all it takes is one drop of poison to turn love to hate. And it continues to, even after he gets what he wants, it continues to gnaw away at him, and it continues to kind of play with him, and it continues to make his life harder and more miserable, but it's so bracing and so sort of fabulously brisk and so unapologetic. Yeah, I was immediately hooked.
I mean, certainly the ending of that book, or novella, I suppose it is a novella. The ending of Double Indemnity, in terms of how it deals with the couple, is in its kind of nihilism. Seems to certainly look forward to the way that Thompson will frequently end a number of his books in terms of the couple, the man-female couple, male-female couple, and how that's going to end. So in a way that's sort of fascinating that you picked that one, because as I was rereading some Thompson ahead of our podcast together, I was reminded frequently of that. And yet at the same time, you sort of think Kane comes across as an Agatha Christie type writer compared with Thompson in terms of the sheer madness of so much of his fiction. He comes across as much more reserved, much more contained, much more traditional as a writer. This isn't a criticism of Kane. One of the interesting things about Mildred Pierce is it's not a crime book. It's a book about opera. And as such, it's operatic. But when they turned it into a terrific 1945 movie, they famously added a crime to it. They added a murder mystery. And I think Kane was polite enough to say, actually, that's probably quite a good idea. I probably should have thought of that. I don't know if he really meant it, but it's sort of interesting. Whereas, of course, when they did the movie of Double Indemnity in 1944, which you've seen?
Barbara Stanwyck.
And Fred McMurray as Walter Neff in the film, and Edward G. Robinson as kind of Fred McMurray's boss.
Yes.
And obviously Chandler is the main contributor to that screenplay, which makes all kinds of changes, some of which were necessitated because of the production code. But they never went for the ending of the book, which oddly enough has an interesting resonance with an early Chandler. The ending of Farewell My Lovely is a bit similar in the sense of a shipboard element, let's put it that way. In the original draft that they wrote, it was, the whole story was told in flashback, it was narrated, and we know that the woman in question, Phyllis Dietrichson, is in the film is dead, and he's on his way out, but originally we actually saw him executed in the gas chamber. And that was filmed, great expense, they built a set, and it was too bleak, too dark, not big a surprise. I mean, there are a number of films from the 30s and 40s where you do end up in the execution chamber, usually gangster movies, as you'd expect. But this was felt to be just too grim. Although, of course, the emphasis would have been still on the Edward G. Robinson character, his kind of paternal sadness at his seeming errant son figure who has done this terrible thing.
There's a lovely bit towards the end where he's like, I always liked you. I always liked you. I really regret that you have been involved in this crime because... And I remember that striking a very strong chord with me. Yeah.
Now, when we talk about Thompson, he started writing in the 30s. He's someone who came from the left that came out of the Depression. And, of course, the Kane novel was originally published during the 1930s. And like The Postman Always Rings Twice, is very much a Depression era novel, and is in fact, they're both derived from a true life case from 1927, when Ruth Snyder and her lover killed her husband and did a terrible, terrible job of it. And Kane was at that time working as a journalist, and so picked up on that story, used it a bit in Personal Ordering Twice, but the crux of that plot was a double indemnity clause in the life insurance, so therefore double indemnity is sort of closer to that. But that was 1927. They were both executed in the gas chamber. Electric chair, excuse me. They both died in the electric chair in Sing Sing. When we get to Thompson, so he's got that background, he's aware of all of this, but he doesn't really start publishing the fiction that we know him for until the late 1940s. And I would argue that, and this is perhaps not a novel most people have read now, but I think that probably a book like Horace McCoy's Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye was a very big influence. If you read that, it feels a lot like Thompson. But it's not terribly well known. It was turned into a movie with James Cagney, and it was turned into a more transitional gangster into noir kind of mode. But because he's a little bit violent, he's much more violent. But the element of psychopathy has been largely removed from the film version. But in the book, it's very much there, and it's someone who's involved with two women and who thinks he's unstoppable, and so on and so forth. When we start thinking about Jim Thompson, I guess the first book was it No More Than Murder? Is that right? Nothing More Than Murder?
His first book was...
crime book, I mean.
Oh, his first crime book. Yeah, I think it probably is Nothing More Than Murder. Yeah, I can't quite remember.
Is that the right place to start? Because it feels very Kane-like to me. It's the closest he gets to Kane seems to be that book.
It's a problematic book in terms of appreciating what Thompson does well, in the way that how many authors' first novel is necessarily the best way to get to know them. This is something I have a great deal of interest in, and I've expended far too much energy thinking about whether the best way to read an author is chronologically. And I don't think there's necessarily a correct answer to that. I don't think one should read, let's say, Anthony Berkeley chronologically, for instance. You'd be put off 3 books in and never pick up any of the stuff that he did that are frank masterpieces. Nothing More Than Murder is a really interesting book because it feels like Thompson really wrestling with the ideas for the first time. And there are some very good principles in it. If I remember correctly, the very first page of Nothing More Than Murder, they've already embarked upon this criminal scheme, and it's already going wrong. The lovely thing about Thompson's characters is that they are all flawed, and they're all a bit shit at what they do. You never come across, as you would in a detective novel from a similar era, the perfect criminal. There's no Arsène Lupin sort of style criminal genius. They're all working men and women, typically working men and sexually frustrated women, who are typically striving for something better than what they have. There's a very rich seam of, I think, a very perverted sense of the American dream, a very selfish sense of the American dream of people being out to get what they want. There's no sense of collective responsibility except for whatever your central couple are in each book. And it's a very common theme in the same way that Agatha Christie dealt a lot with the Eternal Triangle. Thompson deals a lot with essentially 2 lost people, one of them male and conventionally attractive, one of them female and conventionally attractive. The male is usually involved in a very, Kane-esque sort of low-paying job. So they might be an insurance salesman, or they might be involved in some kind of manual labour or something like this. You don't get any professional people. The one exception perhaps being Doc McCoy, who is a professional criminal in The Getaway. But Nothing More Than Murder, the thing I love about it is that it sets that very good benchmark in Thompson's work, in that the criminal schemes pretty much always go wrong. And I love that it's going wrong on the first page. I think he's playing with a handful of change, and he suddenly realises that he shouldn't be wearing gloves because that is immediately suspicious. And I love that. And I feel like Thompson returned to these same ingredients time after time after time, just trying to find new ways for people to very selfishly try to make things better for themselves at the expense, at a very, very savage expense of other people. It's always that someone has to die. It's always that a business needs to be ripped off. It's never it's not the American dream of let's work and let's achieve through our own efforts and our own native intelligence and the fact that it's this wonderful land of opportunity. It is always, you have money that I want. You have a woman that I want. And I'm going to take it from you. I'm going to take her from you. And that's pretty much the theme of Thompson's books. And then it goes wrong.
I mean, that's part of the attraction, surely, is the specular version of the American dream. It's literally noir in the sense of being dark. It's the part that doesn't get celebrated in movies. It's the part that often is the opposite of the Horatio Alger ideal. This isn't about you work hard, you'll succeed. No, this is about avarice. It's about not even people feeling they're entitled to something. They just want it. And they're going to... At best, they're going to be people who maybe have slightly clever ideas about how to get it, which are out of the norm. I mean, we get at least a couple of potential criminal geniuses in his work, perhaps, but they're presented in a very bleak way. So if we were looking to introduce Thompson to a newbie, what book would you recommend? I mean, I know what I would recommend.
Why don't you start? Because I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question.
I mean, I'm tempted on the one hand to recommend The Getaway, because The Getaway, which is a comparatively late book, The Getaway is the one that feels very accessible. It's bleak, it's dark, but the majority of the storyline is in fact very linear. The characters themselves, Carol and Doc, are the kind of hard-boiled criminal types that you anticipate. They're not actually particularly neurotic. They are not, in this case, psychopathic, which is a frequent characteristic of Thompson protagonists. And ultimately, you develop a storyline along traditional lines, fairly tough. Our two protagonists kill several people along the way. They don't always have to, but they just do it because they get them out of the way. And then you get the big ending. And the big ending is fabulous and it's fantastic, and it always gets cut out of the movie versions because it's sort of unfilmable. And so therefore you kind of you get introduced to the Thompson madness in the climax rather than having to live through it. So in a way I always think, well, it's an introduction to that aspect of his books. And if you like it, then you better read The Killer Inside Me, I suppose, or Hell of a Woman,
or Savage Night, or
Savage Night. Yeah. I mean, Savage Night. I would always say almost read that last because it feels very surreal at a certain point.
But then equally, I feel like The Getaway is what people feel they should recommend for Thompson, but I would shy away from I would shy away from starting.
I fell into the trap.
Well, yeah, I would shy away from starting there precisely because of how damn surreal that ending is. Because a lot of that doesn't really exemplify Thompson's work. It was my first Thompson, and I sort of reeled from that ending, and I came away. You're absolutely right. It is a very linear narrative with fairly normal people with fairly understandable aims. There is some very clever writing where you don't realise that they have murdered some people who they absolutely had no need to. And so he does this very clever thing of making you root for these people who he is in no way trying to present sympathetically. There's very interesting, the theme of how committed this central couple are to each other is felt very strongly in The Getaway because of some of what Carol does, which Doc does not necessarily approve of when he learns of it. But apart from the ending, I think The Getaway is a great Thompson to start with. I do just think that ending is so very surreal that it might put people off and be like, well, if his books are going to end like this, then I'm not entirely sure I want that. I mean, I'm always reluctant to say you should pick up somebody's masterpiece first, but the one that I particularly like is Pop 1280.
Ah, okay.
Which I think is a masterpiece.
You don't think that's got to be the toughest of all his books?
I think the toughest is The Killer Inside Me. I think Nick Corey's Psychopathy and The Killer Inside Me is so insanely hard to stomach.
Right.
And so hard if you're on Thompson's wavelength. It's so hard to look away from, but by God, that is a hard book to read. I almost think some of his less sort of plot-centric stuff, like, I don't know, The Golden Gizmo, for instance, is a far easier read. I think Killer Inside Me is a necessary Thompson. Absolutely do not start with it, because it's so hard to read. What I love about Pop 1 to 80 is just how clever it is. How cleverly he plays with character. There is character work in that most authors would give their right eye for. And I love how it starts off seeming like this very innocent, very simple book. There's some brilliant plotting, some really incredibly clever. And as someone who comes to this from a complex detection perspective, I think it's tempted to overlook how very well plotted, not all, but some of Thompson's book, including Pop 1 to 80, including The Killer Inside Me, are. And I just think, as you realise how just the subtle way insanity starts to seep into the narrative, and the very clever way that he is fully aware that he's psychopathic and is able to manipulate the people around him, I would say the only thing against Pop 1 to 80 is that the ending is terrible.
Well, actually, but you're absolutely right about the ending, because it's a bit of a non-ending, isn't it?
It just stops, and I think it's in a way it is a fault of the book being so perfectly realised. Thompson spent, I think, on average, something like 2.5 months writing any book, and I think it is a fault of how perfectly realised that book is, that he does not know how to extricate himself from it. He's got this amazing world, these amazing characters, they're so beautifully imbricated in each other's lives, but he's coming to the end of his 2.5-3 month period of writing, so he has to get a book out, and he does not know how to end it, and so he's trying to effectively what he wants. And it's a similar thing in something like, what am I thinking of? Modern novelists have done a similar thing, like Dennis Lehane in Shutter Island, where they're trying to make a point about, I don't want to spoil either Pop 1 to 80 or Shutter Island, but I feel there is a point something they're trying to do with the characters in the final moments to kind of make this wonderful closing fillip. And I think the problem is that everything that comes before the ending of Pop 1 to 80 is perfect. Every part of that book is perfect. And actually, he should have spent a year writing it and probably another couple of pages properly put in another plot strand and tied things up a bit more neatly. But instead it just sort of ends on this weird moment where a bit like the same way that The Getaway ending, but that's much more drawn out. I feel he just kind of condenses it down to a moment. The idea is the psychopathy just overtakes the narrator, essentially, in the end. And it's very much left up in the air, what I was saying at the start about what noir is, this idea of not being desperate to provide easy or palatable answers. And I mean, I first read that book 20 years ago, and I still remember getting to the ending, and I think I've read it 2 or 3 times since, and I still don't know quite what to make of the ending. It lives tremendously rent-free in my head.
There's an interesting thing about the Thompson endings, the famous endings, of which there are many. On the one hand, you don't expect a noir author, certainly not the pulp fiction type noir author, who, for instance, in between 1953 and 1954, Thompson published 10 paperback originals. That's his kind of huge wave of work. After that, it was kind of 1 or 2 a year maximum. And in total, he published some 30 books, roughly between 1949 and the early 1970s. But that includes some novelizations and things like that.
Ironside, wasn't there?
That's right, he did an Ironside, and he did some movies as well, and, paid work. That's all it was. Not really recognisable as coming from him in terms of his very distinct personality as an author. But one of the extraordinary things about a writer of this ilk is how amazingly powerful those endings can be. To me, they feel even better, but more emotionally satisfying than the big resolve of big, complex, golden age, locked room mystery type stories. And I love those kinds of books, as you know, you and I have talked about it often enough. But I find it extraordinary that so many of his endings, as you say, because the plotting is often quite intricate, this can be handled in multiple ways, of course. It can be that you realise that the narrator has been unreliable, or that the narrator is self-deluded, or that the narrator is even more psychopathic or schizophrenic even than we thought they were, and they are unaware of their own issues. So they think they've been a lot cleverer than it turns out they really are, which is always fascinating. But equally, you also have a lot of reversals and plot twists in the finales, so that things that you didn't know about suddenly become a factor, and they're exciting and unexpected, and you just don't think books like that. I mean, the comparison to me would be somebody like Gil Brewer. I don't know how much you've read of Gil Brewer.
Nothing.
I will lend you some if you're interested.
Cool.
But he was, and the other kind of fairly successful writer of this type who wrote in this mode. People who maybe were inspired by Cain in particular, or maybe even James Hadley Chase. That kind of success in popular fiction, where you have the more, and this is about reading, not about accomplishment, but people read them in a way about, it's the femme fatale, it's the criminal plot, it's the surprise ending, and then maybe even almost a tragic finale that is what you would get in Cain, because you actually potentially get some weird empathy for these often disreputable characters. And somebody like Gil Brewer, who again is a fairly accomplished writer in his own way, but who, for instance, ended up writing some of the Ellery Queen paperback originals, for instance. Not the ones with Ellery Queen, the ones that, but he would also do this kind of writing, ghost writing in essence, and you got paid a flat fee, maybe $2,000, and you had to supply a manuscript of a certain length by a certain date, done. Thompson did writing like that, but at his peak, at his best, and Pop 1280 is almost his last major work. This is in the 1960s, and you can read it as a rewrite of The Killer Inside Me to a certain extent. I mean, it's ironic that we got the names of the characters mixed up, because it is a bit similar to The Killer Inside Me after all.
Yeah.
It's a much tougher book. It's actually much more vulgar. The language is much harsher, for instance, but also the kind of emphasis on, shall we say, scatological detail, grotesque elements. But the fact that you have these extraordinary endings, and in a way it's kind of a bit cruel, because to sit here and talk about the endings would be a mean thing to do, but to talk about, let's talk about the structure of one ending of a book that I think we both admire tremendously, which is Hell of a Woman, which is, first of all, a bizarre title, because it doesn't seem to go with the book, does it?
No, it's really. I reread it recently, and I remember.
Me too.
I remember it being much more about. I forget her name, but I remember it. Mona. And I remembered it being much more about the eponymous woman, and actually, it really isn't. It's really interesting.
Well, the women sort of become weird, because you've got his wife, who is Joyce. Mona is the sort of the young woman who he thinks he's saving, but really he's not. And is she a kidnapped victim? Isn't she?
Yep.
And then you get this potential other wife called Helen.
That's right. Who
exists or may not exist. We're not quite sure by the end of the book.
That's right.
And yet it's not what the book's about.
No. I almost feel like A Hell of a Woman could be the title for a lot of Thompson's novels, because it is that theme of this slightly downtrodden, this very downtrodden man.
He's a door-to-door salesman, isn't he? Yeah.
But I mean, most Thompson protagonists are these downtrodden men who come across a hell of a woman who, again, Cain, it's double indemnity. They suddenly come across this astonishing woman, and there is this very sudden volte-face in their libidinous worldview, their moral worldview, their professional worldview, where suddenly it is the woman is the catalyst for what happens. The argument could be made that it's I mean, this is not my perspective at all, but you could say, oh, well, everything was all right until they met this woman, and you could say, well, there's this very misogynistic reading, if you like. I find it incredible that he got so much out of this same sort of plot device, that it's pretty much always the same setup. He happens to meet this woman. I mean, notably, the two really big, or the three really big titles, Pop 1 to 80, Killer Inside Me, Getaway, do not rely on this structure. But I feel like A Hell of a Woman it's almost like that's one of the post-it notes that he puts in like chapter 2 when he's planning his book. Here's my broken down protagonist. Yeah. Chapter 2, A Hell of a Woman.
What I find fascinating about Hell of a Woman in terms of our conversation here is that you look at that, and on the one hand, let's say he probably maybe didn't even come up with the title. Say it was, someone at the publisher decided that was a good title. Perhaps. So they just stick it on. Yeah. Could have appeared on any one of a number of books from that era of that type. But it's a door-to-door salesman who works for the lowest end of the business. It's a kind of horrible company that sells real tat, and people get hooked into hire purchase agreements or paying on the never, and part of what he has to do is sell, and the other half is actually try and get people to pay up what they owe on their monthly payment for what they bought before. And it's always horrible stuff. You see him at the very beginning of the novel. The first, he goes to this house, and it's this situation where he sees the face of this woman and catches his eye. There's something about her that catches his eye, and then it gets very weird almost instantly. She's living in this house with this older lady who's a much tougher lady, but it turns out this tough lady has money and a gun, and ultimately he decides to, because he's gone home, his wife, in this totally splenetic sequence, basically says, I'm walking out on you, you're an idiot, and it's all over between them. So she wanders off, and that's Joyce. And he goes back, and he's bumped into Mona again, and he sort of says, okay, we're going to knock off your aunt and steal her money, and you're going to have to stick around for a bit and pretend it was this other person, and he's going to set somebody up to do it, and then it'll be fine. We'll walk off with that money. And of course, it's this line from Jackie Brown, the movie, which is that, $500,000 will always be missed. Turns out that the aunt has a lot of money. So it creates its own momentum. It's the nexus is the money core is there, and then the book gets extremely strange. And one of the things that is so important about Thompson, so many of his endings slip into a form of surrealism that, as a reader, I keep thinking he kind of belongs with people like William Burroughs and maybe Charles Bukowski, because he was someone who also drank a great deal, unfortunately, and should be remembered with authors of that ilk. But you also get this fascination that he has with, let's call it multiple personality disorder. What the hell? But it comes in so many different ways, because, of course, in Pop 1 to 80, it's about a character putting on a mask, deliberately trying to seem to be someone other than what they are, to fake people out. And in the case of Pop 1 to 80 or Killer Inside Me, they're kind of law enforcement officers who actually are sort of like genius criminals in a weird way, but they hide their intelligence and appear to be rather dull, uninteresting people so that they can get along in life. In this case, and in so many others, you go from someone who is simply deflecting who they are into someone who doesn't know who they are. In Hell of a Woman, talk us through it, because there's some fascinating technique on display here, which is what makes me think of William Burroughs a bit.
If we're able to kind of spoil the ending, or able to sort of talk about
I think we can. I think with that one we can.
In some sort of detail. Essentially, what happens is the protagonist is forced through such a mill of realization and confusion. And as we say, we're not entirely sure if there was this previous woman he was married to, or if he just thinks he was married to her. Essentially, what happens at the end is that, and I always thought it would be more powerful if the final two chapters were swapped, actually. And I reread it, and I was like, yeah, I still think, actually, the final chapter So essentially what happens in the final chapter is that the protagonist starts to have essentially a schizophrenic episode where these two different voices in his head start to sort of reflect on the events that he's gone through. And yeah, Sergio has just corrected me that originally Thompson wanted it presented as 2 columns down the page. I think I got confused with the Ellery Queen book, where there's space down the side of the page for you to write your deductions. Is it the Dutch shoe mystery or
probably?
Anyway,
Yes, I think that's
sorry,
right.
I got confused, and Sergio has very kindly just corrected me. Thompson's original plan was for it to be presented in 2 columns. Actually, it is presented as a series of consecutive paragraphs, some in normal text, some in italicized text, which run into each other, but obviously interrupt each other, which leapfrog each other, as he has this very elaborate mental breakdown, essentially. And precisely what happens at the end of this,
You don't have to go into it. It's pretty horrible.
Right. I feel it's kind of left, there's a certain amount of interpretation available to it.
For me, it's definitely a self-immolation.
Fine.
Let's put it that way.
Fine. And it is, Sergio's right, it's horrible. When you read them individually, so if you just read the italicized text and see the nature of the thoughts going through, and then just read the Roman text and see the nature of the thoughts developing there, it's almost worse when you realise that these are the 2 things that are being thrown together, and it's wonderfully disorienting. It kind of comes out of nowhere. The first time I read it, I did not know quite what to make of it. And it is a very, very, very bracing way to finish a book. It's a very experimental way to finish a book, particularly given the nature of the plot that has occurred. Now, arguably, the inciting incident for this is what happens, which I will not spoil, at the end of the previous chapter, where I feel there's an almost a sense that the title might have, I suppose, some meaning when you apply it to the end of the previous chapter. But I almost thought it would be really interesting if those 2 chapters were swapped and he had the breakdown, and then what happens at the end of the previous chapter is how the book closed. I feel that would have, for me, more of an impact. But it is fascinating, and it does this thing we talked about, with The Getaway that Thompson does so well, of disguising, while telling you something really quite awful, disguising it very, very well. I don't read a lot outside of detective fiction, classic era detective fiction, but I would struggle to think of too many authors I have read who would be willing to be that sudden in their genre change. If you published it today, people would either laud it as a masterpiece or they'd refuse to publish it, I think, because of just how wildly it veers off the reservation in the closing stages. Yeah. And it is fascinating, and it is fascinating that you get this, again, for Thompson, this fairly standard mix of ingredients that for, let's say, 22 of the 23 chapters is pretty much exactly what you expect a Thompson book to be.
Although it is, you get this, when you reread it, of course, it's fascinating, as I just did, when you realise that there are certain moments when he starts to, he's either forgotten something or he second guesses himself and gives a slightly different explanation. But then you get these chapters written in the first person,
yes,
but they're signed as his name but spelled backwards.
Spelled backwards.
So instead of Frank Dillon, it's however you say Frank Dillon backwards.
Nolid Gnarf.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah.
And you get this alternate version, more of a self-justification.
Yes.
And what's intriguing to me, it's something that we've gotten a little bit more used to in the cinema, because you have this possibility of presenting something in 2 alternate ways. The subjectivity of cinema, which is even better to achieve in a book, but can be confusing. And you do wonder how confused some readers might have been. Certainly, I would argue that it's very experimental, but to me, the most experimental ending that he ever came up with is probably the one in Savage Night, which is a very odd book in some respects. And in a way, we don't want to spoil it, so let's not get into it.
No, I think we shouldn't
much,
spoil the ending of Savage Night, particularly. It's.
But it is extraordinary work.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, it feels like it's a very modernist author. And you're telling stories in a way that is very much post-war.
Yep.
And almost, it's not quite postmodern in a way. It is very much the modernist style.
I would agree.
You could sort of say, well, it's a bit cubist. It's a bit this. This is stuff that was going out 25 cents a copy
Yeah.
on the racks and the shelves. And that's what's extraordinary. This is a real poet of the shadows. There's someone who's really writing brave, experimental, very personal work. I mean, he wrote a book called The Alcoholics, and he was essentially an alcoholic, and certainly had a very serious drink problem. And yet at the same time, he was able to do other kinds of work and was disappointed. I mean, you and I were talking about some of the screen work that he did directly. He worked most famously of all with Stanley Kubrick. This appears to have been a very vexed relationship, even though it was for 2 films and they worked on a third, which then didn't get made. It seems quite clear that Kubrick ended up taking more credit than Thompson thought he should have, particularly on The Killing, where he wrote most of the script and yet gets a dialogue credit. It's an adaptation of the Lionel White novel Clean Break. It's an influential movie. I mentioned earlier Jackie Brown is an Elmore Leonard adaptation by Tarantino, but it has this shift in its telling of a caper in the final third where there's a time shift, and that's from the Lionel White novel, which then got expanded for the film. And that's clearly what the attraction for Kubrick was. You could argue, well, that feeds into the kind of thing that Thompson was so good at, which is this telling things from different points of view, but also rubbing together and creating this real sense of unease in terms of you don't know who's who. One of the books that would be interesting to discuss is a book that now feels more straightforward. How do you feel about The Grifters?
I'm not such a fan of The Grifters, to be honest. The Grifters is the book where, for me, Thompson doesn't quite get his cards squared at the edges in the way that he seemed to elsewhere. You have these 3 characters who we are told have these astonishing impact on each other's lives. But it felt to me as if they just kind of wander in and out of scenes together. And for me, I never really bought the sordid nature of those relationships in the way that I completely do with practically every other Thompson.
It's not as intense, is it?
It's nowhere. I feel like he wants it to be as intense. And he wants it to have these kind, because you see the way in which everybody's sort of pulled between each other. It's not a love triangle because it's a man and his mother and the woman.
Well, incest is a theme that recurs in at least 3 other of his books. Yeah, it's got to be said. It's definitely there.
Yes.
Because, of course, the character plays on it with her son, of course. That's sort of the climax of the book. And that is disturbing.
Yes.
But I agree. And until you get to that, perhaps, it's more about who's conning who is the tagline of the movie adaptation from 1990.
But I don't feel that's the focus of the book at all. I feel the book is very much it's trying to convince you. I don't know if it feels in the same way that Pop 1 to 80 is so perfectly realised. I felt The Grifters, he probably had a nice idea and just could not get his head around it. I haven't seen the film, the Stephen Frears, isn't it, with John Cusack?
That's right, it's a terrific movie.
I haven't actually seen it.
Fairly faithful. It focuses on the women more, which is interesting. Yeah. So I think it's why they decided to do it a little bit.
It begins with seduction.
The lady or the loot?
It leads to betrayal.
You're working some angle, and don't tell me you're not, because I wrote the book.
What do you sell anyway?
Self-confidence.
In Thompson's work, of course, they're not. Some of them are third person.
Yep.
And they're perhaps the less interesting books. Certainly, The Grifters is a third person narrative.
It is.
Whereas these first person narratives, like Hell of a Woman,
Nothing More Than Murder,
Killer Inside Me, Bop 1 to 80, and Savage Night.
Yep.
They're very much his ability to get under the skin of these sorts of people is what is so extraordinary and so memorable. So unlike any other author. We've thrown in some other writers here, but the truth is you read Thompson and you sort of think, accept no substitute. This is brilliant.
He has this remarkable ability to make you don't root for these people because you are aware that they are just such utter bastards. But he does have an ability to really invest you in what is going to happen. I mean, spoilers for 80% of Jim Thompson's work, they probably die, right?
Yes.
You know?
or will be dead very soon.
Right, yeah,
Yes.
exactly. You know, I mean, one of the first-person novels, I'm not going to spoil which one, the final novel, the final line is the guy narrating his own death, where he is shot and he bleeds to death, which is a very interesting narrative technique because people would pick it apart these days. But he has this real ability to make you root for these people. I think there's something about, like you said, about A Hell of a Woman. There's something about perhaps the lives that these men lead and the lives that these women lead that you almost wouldn't wish it upon anybody. I mean, A Hell of a Woman's incredible because Mona is being effectively pimped out by her aunt. So she is effectively using sexual favours from Mona to pay for things that she wants, even though she has $500,000 hidden in the basement, which is awful. I mean, it's really, when you say it out loud, it's a horrendous life to subject any character to.
And there is an interesting, again, we're not going to spoil it, but you get this, what is meant to be an unexpected. I think we all know it's coming, given the type of book it is, but a character sort of turns up and explains things that the narrator simply did not know.
Yes.
And in fact lies about quite a lot of it, in fact, but nonetheless explains so that we are given a way to rationalise these extremes of behaviour.
Right.
These horrible extremes of behaviour. Which is interesting how that gets in there.
Yes. But then equally there are times when he just gets bastard characters and makes you root for them, like the McCoys in The Getaway. You know, there's nothing terribly sympathetic about the McCoys.
No.
They betray the guy who helped them carry out a robbery. It's wonderfully written. Thompson's economy of prose, I think the scene in which they betray their confrère is one of the most muscularly and brilliantly written scenes probably in the whole of fiction. It's incredible. It was almost worth reading the book just for that scene alone. There's nothing sympathetic about them. They've just robbed a bank and they want more money. They want all of the money rather than 2/3 of the money, essentially.
Well, and we were having a quick word about the movie, which it's one of those things that Thompson never had great commercial success. He churned out these paperback originals. He would get paid. He probably did slightly better with his screen work, but that never went very far, partly because he kind of got locked into the whole Kubrick thing, and as we know, Kubrick was this very intense but very awkward, difficult, sort of insular sort of person, and in the end it didn't lead to work with other people, which is a shame. But then again, given how singular Thompson's approach could be, although he wrote some westerns, he wrote some other things, it's not hard to understand why you couldn't flexibly use him in all kinds of other things. And there was the drink problem, although let's face it, in Hollywood with writers, not that unusual at the time. I think drinking was very much part of the game. It's like all those people endlessly smoking in movies. You're thinking, oh my God. Nonetheless, you get this sense that this is someone who was appreciated by the fans a bit, but recognition came after he died.
Very late.
The one success he had was the movie adaptation of The Getaway, which the first of two, which came out in 1972, stars
two of the coolest people on the planet.
That's right. So we're talking about Steve McQueen and Ali MacGraw, and they play Doc and Carol.
Directed by the coolest director to ever live,
Sam Peckinpah. And written by an extremely good writer, Walter Hill. And originally the film was going to be directed by Peter Bogdanovich, and he backed away and Peckinpah came in. As a film, it's pretty faithful to the book up to a point, and there is a lot of Peckinpah in it. So in a way, he's sort of an interesting person to take on Thompson, but it would have, particularly if you've seen, Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, you think, well, that's very Thompson-ish in lots of ways. It would have been great if they'd done one of these difficult texts, and instead they've taken the linear one because it was meant to be what it turned out to be, a big commercial hit. So it's a thriller that's accessible, it has lots of action, it has big stars who are sort of wonderful, very good score by Quincy Jones, it looks amazing, it's shot in scope by Lucien Ballard, who is a brilliant DP, and yet, as a fan of the book, you can't help feeling a bit disappointed, because let's face it, I mean, Doc and Carol, they kind of almost don't kill anybody in the movie.
No.
Except really, really bad people who are way worse than they are. So those characters are more than a bit softened.
Yeah.
You famously don't get the big ending, the crazy ending.
Yep.
And in fact, when the film was remade, they reused the same script by Walter Hill and updated it a bit, and still didn't use the ending. So in fact, if you want the ending that even vaguely gives you an idea of what it's going to be about, you have to go and watch From Dusk Till Dawn, the Robert Rodriguez film, where the whole thing is about they're all off to El Rey.
Yeah.
And but you don't even see it there.
No.
But there's an acknowledgement that this exists, that there is a, and that's obviously just a playful thing from Tarantino, who wrote the script for that. And when he died in the mid-70s, none of Thompson's books were apparently in print in America. They were in France. Some of his films have been filmed there very successfully, and obviously in variant forms. They're not set in America,
No.
so they feel very different. But you've got major directors like Bertrand Tavernier doing his version of Pop 1280, fascinating adaptations, and there was much more awareness of his work through that. He was taken more seriously, but the real success in terms of republishing, film adaptations, real money coming in, all happened after he died. There was this renewed interest in him in the mid to late 80s. And so The Grifters is one of the more noteworthy adaptations that came from that time, but there was The Kill Off, directed by Maggie Greenwald. There's After Dark, My Sweet, which is actually a terrific book, which has a sort of happy ending.
Oh, yeah, we should talk about After Dark, My Sweet.
Well, go for it.
How has that not come up? Because yes, that is almost a very atypical Thompson, isn't it? Because like you say, it's still the same sorts of ingredients. Is it a happy ending? It's certainly not.
Well, it has a sort of self-sacrificing ending.
Yes.
So
yes. There's something. There's an element of kind of redemption or nobility or something, which is very absent from pretty much all of the rest of Thompson's criminous work. There is a sense of actually committing to this, whether it's kind of self-betterment or there's that idea of that suddenly very incredibly strong, almost gravitational pull of emotions that the Thompson characters are submitted to. That might be the one time it actually pays off in a traditional way.
Yeah, but that works. That works. I think it's a good book, and it works well. And actually, the movie adaptation is very good too.
Yeah, okay.
With Jason Patric in the main role, which. But this is the late 80s. Sure. This is about 1989, I think. Okay. I think James Foley directed it. But I think that's right. I haven't seen that for a while.
Okay.
But it's terrific. But that's the thing. I mean, if we go back a little bit to, just to finish off maybe, Jim, where we started. I sort of annoyingly said to you, what's the best way to start with Thompson? What's the gateway book? And you sort of say, well, gateway is the wrong word because he's so specific and he's so special that you're either going to get him or you don't. And so I sort of said, well, you could ease your way in, but you're saying, no, but you've got to go for the gut, go for Pop 1280.
I don't, well, see, now you've got me thinking about After Dark, My Sweet. And thinking about After Dark, My Sweet makes me think of a Swell-Looking Babe.
Ah, okay, right. Yes, interesting.
I'm now really dredging back through my memories of stuff.
There's a French movie of that as well.
Is there?
Yeah, for instance.
Because they are both really good books. I have not read them I will admit, vague on the details.
Yeah, me too, I'm afraid. I've got the same omnibus edition in which they appear, so I know I read them all around the same time.
But I remember being very struck by them, and they left a very positive sense, in the sense of how much do you really remember of any of the books that you read. Actually, After Dark, My Sweet is probably a really good one. A Swell-Looking Babe, if you can find it, is probably a really good one because they're quite short. So you're not going to get to the end of it, and the Getaway.
Well, they're all quite short.
Well, The Getaway is a relatively long book, and The Killer Inside Me is a relatively long book for Thompson.
Yeah, they're all less than 200 pages. Let's be clear.
And then I've got The Getaway over there. Anyway,
yes, let's go count the pages.
Yeah. But even for Thompson, they are quite short books, and I think they they stick their landings reasonably well. I think you started off talking about Nothing More Than Murder, or I think the ending of that is, I don't know. I think the way that plays out, there's a lovely grinding inevitability about it, which is what I love about Thompson. The man was never scared to shy away from something because it might not be a popular form of literature. He had a tremendous commitment to these very downer milieus and these very pessimistic, you said nihilistic earlier, I think that's a good word to use in the context of Thompson, these very pessimistic sort of stories which took what were essentially probably the trappings of much more upbeat fiction, namely this sudden opportunity at a change of life, at a change of circumstance, new love with an interesting new woman, with someone who you can, turn your life around and save and make their life better and make your life better. And he wasn't scared to make that a corrupting thing. You could almost suggest that he was a bit obsessed with making that a corrupting thing. But the strength with which he saw it through cannot be understated. He is not scared of showing how these things can be, usually are, very negative. He writes about these negative things in a very romantic way. It's a fascinatingly sort of perverted form of romance writing. He is very much in love with that. Everybody kind of grabbing hold of each other and being pulled down similarly by the maelstrom that results from that, which is why he fits so perfectly with the trappings of noir. And that's a horribly depressing way to sum up an author's work. But something like After Dark, My Sweet, something like A Swell-Looking Babe, the ideas are perhaps explored in a slightly more traditionally novelistic way that would then prepare you for The Getaway, that would then prepare you for the complete non-ending of Pop 1 280, that would prepare you for Savage Night, which I think is a really fabulous book. Very odd, but a fabulous book. Yeah, I mean, I've got 20 years of Thompson that I'm just trying to work back through, but I do wonder if those two might. I think I'm going to change my mind and say not Pop 1 280, get A Swell-Looking Babe, or get
After Dark,
My Sweet.
Perfect.
Start there.
Well, on that note, Jim, I thank you so much, and I'm, of course, now going to have to go and reread After Dark, My Sweet right away.
Yes, of
so
course.
So thanks for that very much.
No, not at all. It is always lovely to be able to talk about Thompson. I am very much in the man's thrall. He is, as I said at the start, so very different to the genteel stuff that I'm usually reading. And it's a delight to find a fellow fan. Lovely to have any excuse to witter on about him for us. So thank you so much for thinking of me when you were talking about putting this together.
You were the only person I could think of, Jim. And I mean that in a good way.
I hope so. I am going to take that to be a positive thing, yeah.
You have been listening to Tipping My Fedora, the show about all things noir. It is produced for Castiglione Publishing by me, Sergio Angelini, and our theme tune is by Petar Milinkovic, whose work is available through Tailkeeper Music. All audio clips are the copyright of their respective owners, and used under fair dealing and fair use exceptions solely for the purposes of criticism and review. Please subscribe to Tipping My Fedora wherever you get your podcast fix. And it would be great if you could leave ratings and reviews about the show at Apple Podcasts. Be seeing you.